Oh, is it good to be back? We've been traveling very heavily lately because of trade shows, and it is nice to be back in my closet studio for episode 57 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. And in this episode, we're going to talk about something that many people have been asking us about: how salt systems actually work. Specifically, why do they not work in cold water? Why do they not work when salt levels are low and things like that? And so in this episode, what I want to try to do is go through I think it's kind of complicated chemistry, but we're going to go through the chemistry of what actually happens in the salt system and do our best to distill that down so it can be understood. Episode 57. I'm Eric Knight with Orenda. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go.
Now, the first thing that I need to say is I need to give credit where it's due. I'm not a chemist. I listen to chemists and I read what they publish, and I try to distill it down and simplify it for our readers and our listeners of our podcast, just like you. This is pretty complex. I feel like I know water chemistry pretty well, but I am not a chemist, and this is happening very, very quickly in a salt cell. A salt system is, it's like a foot long at most on a residential pool. Some of them are even smaller, and water's passing through it very quickly. So this chemistry is happening very, very quickly. And I'm going to try to break down what's actually happening. I'm going to do the best I can, and if you're a chemist listening to this, I apologize in advance if I screw something up, but I do have the formulas written in front of me, so I know I've got the right information on the screen, but this will be a simplified version of it, because you don't have to remember the chemistry. What I want you to think about here is think about the consequences of the chemistry. Think about the byproducts of what the net effect is at the end of the day. Okay, the net effect we know on saltwater pools is the pH will go up on them. It doesn't skyrocket up, but it will go up, and I'm going to explain why. So first of all, before we go any further, there's one main thing you need to know about saltwater pools. Salt pools are chlorine pools. Maybe I need to say that again. Salt pools are, in fact, chlorine pools. If you have a pool, or you have a friend who has a pool, and you might think it's a chlorine-free pool because it's a salt system, maybe you should forward this episode to that friend and keep listening, because it is a chlorine pool indeed. Don't worry, though. It's not all bad news. What salt systems actually do is they create chlorine on site. And that's pretty cool, because we are in the midst of a chlorine shortage right now, and you can create chlorine on site with a salt chlorine generator. And there's two types of salt systems. Well, two types worth discussing, I should say. The first type is a typical salt pool. You're swimming in salt water, and there's an inline salt system, or salt cell. Some people call them saltwater generators, or SWGs. Same thing. The other type is called a brining system, and that is a self-contained device that contains a lot of salt water. I shouldn't say a lot, it's usually a small amount, but it is salt water within a device that creates chlorine inside of it, and it releases the chlorine into your circulation system. So you get the chlorine, but you don't get the salinity in the actual pool. And that can have some benefits too, but you could have less corrosion issues and whatever else. But that's the two types. You have a brining system, and you have a standard traditional saltwater pool. So let's talk about how these systems actually work. First things first, a saltwater pool has dissolved salt in it, of course, and salt is sodium chloride, NaCl. When you dissolve salt in water, the sodium breaks apart from the chloride, and that chloride is what we need to focus on here, because when salt water passes through a salt cell, it is charged with electricity in a process called electrolysis. That changes the game, and it actually creates chlorine and a bunch of other things. So let's talk about what a salt cell actually is first. If you ever look inside a salt cell from the perspective of water, when water flows through the pipes, it's going to see what, well, from its perspective, I guess it would look kind of like vertical lines. It'll be jail bars. What it basically is blades. from a salt cell. These are titanium. They are thin. They are covered in an element called ruthenium, and they are pretty close together. I mean, usually less than a quarter of an inch apart. And there's a lot of them. Some have probably 20 blades, maybe 12. It depends on the manufacturer. But essentially, water is flowing between these thin metal blades. And these metal blades are charged with electricity, and they pass electricity from one side to the other through the gap between them. That process of passing electricity creates electrolysis. Every so often, depending on how the salt system is made and programmed, the direction of electricity will change. So one side is an anode, the other is a cathode. And depending on how that system is made, maybe it's on a 10-minute cycle or a 5-minute cycle or something like that, the electricity will reverse directions. So if you have a salt system, you know that you can run it at 100% or 50% or 70% or something like that. What that means is based on whatever time signature that it has, say it's on a 10-minute cycle, if I'm running it at 70%, it is going to be charging electricity through it for 7 minutes, and then it will not for 3 minutes. And then when it charges back up, the reverse will happen. So when the electricity turns on, it's actually going to be going in the opposite direction this time. The cathode becomes the anode, and the electricity goes back the other way. This is called reversing polarity. We've done several episodes on flakes in saltwater pools. That's because calcium carbonate will form, because of scale formation, high pH on the cathode side, where the hydroxide is produced. We're going to explain the chemistry in a moment. Why did I say we? I am going to explain the chemistry in a moment. On the cathode side of this, where the electricity goes, a hydroxide is produced. And on the anode side, chlorine gas is produced. This is important because chlorine gas is very acidic and hydroxide is very basic. And these two actually neutralize each other. But the net effect is on the cathode side, you can actually get scale, and scale will get dissolved off or fractured off when the polarity changes, because now you have acidic chlorine gas being produced on the cathode, and that kind of sloughs off that scale, and you get flakes in your pool. We did an episode on that. We have a whole article on how you can prevent that, but basically you have to flush out the system, manage your LSI, and if you still have trouble with it, you can chelate your calcium with SC1000 for extra help. But the point is, electricity is running between these blades. Now, ruthenium is kind of a cool thing. It is coating the titanium blades, and what it does is it lowers the amount of energy required to pass electricity between the two blades. In other words, it reduces the amount of electricity necessary to create chlorine from salt water. It improves efficiency. It also improves surface area, or it increases surface area because it's kind of porous if you look at it at a microscopic level, as opposed to titanium, which is really flat and smooth. Ruthenium actually is not flat and smooth, from what I'm told. It has a lot more surface area and contact area to create a lot more electron transfer or electrical current. So you can create a lot more chlorine with it. It's a very good thing. Now, when electricity passes through, it's going to be focused on that chloride. Now, we dissolve salt in there. The sodium breaks apart. Don't worry, sodium. We're going to come back to you in a minute. That chloride goes through, and it gets charged with electricity and becomes chlorine gas. So I'm going to do my best now to read what this formula actually says. All right? And for the chemists out there, I'm reading off a sheet, and I'm going to simplify from here. Okay, you have 2 chloride ions plus 2 water molecules, H2O, charged with electricity, and it creates chlorine gas, which is Cl2, hydrogen gas, which is H2, and 2 hydroxides, which is OH minus. Now, the chlorine gas at this point is no different from the chlorine that is created by any type of chlorine that you would add. Whether it's cal-hypo or liquid chlorine or trichlor, that chlorine will dissolve in water, so you got chlorine gas plus water when it dissolves, to create HOCl, hypochlorous acid, the strong killing form of chlorine that if you've listened to this podcast, you should be very familiar with. That is the chlorine that does the disinfection in our pool. HOCl, hypochlorous acid. That is created along with a hydrogen ion and a chloride ion. Those bind together and you get hydrochloric acid, which actually kind of neutralizes well, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but basically you have HOCl. HOCl, as you may know from other videos and from whatever research you've done online, HOCl will further dissociate depending on the pH. The lower the pH, the higher the percentage of HOCl, and this is in equilibrium. You're going to have more hydrogen connected to it, so it's HOCl. The higher the pH, you lose that hydrogen, and you get OCl minus, which is the much weaker form of chlorine, hypochlorite ion. So you basically have three subsequent reactions. First is the chloride getting zapped, creating chlorine gas, hydrogen gas, and hydroxide. Next, we're going to focus on that chlorine gas, and that dissolves and creates hypochlorous acid and hydrochloric acid. And then let's focus on that hypochlorous acid, HOCl, that can dissociate into hydrogen and hypochlorite ion. Whew, I think I said that right. Pretty sure I said that right. Okay, cool. So another way to think about this is the chloride ion plus water with electricity will create hypochlorous acid and a hydroxide. So instead of having two chlorides and two waters going in and creating this, you could have one chloride with two waters, and you'd have one hypochlorous acid, one hydrogen gas, and one hydroxide. Yeah. Are you lost yet? I feel like you're lost, and that's okay because I'm lost. I'm just reading all of these signs, and I'm not a chemist. And if you're a chemist listening to this, how did you get by? How did you go through school and not get bored of this? This is, I mean, it's fascinating because it's important. It's how the world works. But, whew, let's take a breather. Let's pause and reflect that we got through this together. I feel really good about this. Okay. Now, remember I said to sodium, hey, sodium, don't go anywhere. We're going to need you in a minute. Because we were just focused on the chloride. Let's bring the sodium back into it. Now, what did that sodium do? Well, the sodium doesn't get affected by the electricity, but it does bind to that hydroxide that was created, that high pH hydroxide, and creates sodium hydroxide, NaOH. Has a very high pH of about 13. But the chlorine gas that was created on the anode side, which is opposite because the sodium hydroxide is created at the cathode side, the chlorine gas neutralizes the high pH because that's very acidic, neutralizes the high pH of the sodium hydroxide, and you're left with pretty much a wash, like a neutralized pH situation. So why then does the pH go up on a saltwater pool? I mean, originally I was taught, and I think it's conventional wisdom in the pool business, that salt systems raise the pH because of sodium hydroxide. Well, they would if it weren't for that chlorine gas. What happens is we have to go back to the hydrogen gas, and hydrogen gas is H2. H2 is different from H+, which is a hydrogen ion. This is what confused me. This is why I had to reach out to Richard, and he explained this in depth, and you should see the email. It's several paragraphs worth. But this is an important distinction to make. A hydrogen ion is going to drive pH down because it's pure acid, basically. Hydrogen gas does not dissolve in water, or at least it doesn't in this situation. H2 bubbles off and it leaves the water. And this all happens in the salt cell. So when H2 leaves, it creates turbulence and aeration, and that turbulence and aeration causes the loss of carbon dioxide. Yeah. If you remember a few episodes ago, we've talked about it several times, the pH of your water is largely determined by the amount of CO2 dissolved in your water. So if you lose CO2 through aeration, the pH goes up. This is happening in your salt cell too. So the pH goes up because that hydrogen gas causes turbulence, and you actually lose CO2. Yeah, the sodium hydroxide would raise the pH, but the chlorine gas neutralizes it. And one of the things that Richard said to consider is the length of pipe from your salt cell to your pool. If you have a short run of pipe and the return inlet in the wall, let's say, is aimed up at the surface, like the eyeball fitting, it's aimed up at the surface, it may not be enough time, in some cases, for the chlorine gas to stay dissolved, and it may actually off gas and the pH goes up even faster because you need that chlorine gas to effectively neutralize the sodium hydroxide. Then you're just dealing with the loss of CO2. Pretty interesting, I think, but also very confusing. And you could see why I said at the beginning of this, I need to really distill this down because it is complex. It is complicated chemistry. So I'm going to try to recap what happens here and simplify it. Salt water is flowing through a salt system, and the salt system has a bunch of narrow blades, just less than a quarter inch apart. And electricity is charged and is passing between these blades, anode side to cathode side. When that happens, the chloride is charged and becomes a chlorine gas, Cl2. It is also creating hydrogen gas and hydroxide because water is involved. So you got water plus 2 chloride and blah, 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 blah. And then, the process of chlorination happens, as we discussed, with hypochlorous acid from that chlorine gas. Then the sodium comes back in, binds to the hydroxide, which gets neutralized by the chlorine gas's pH, but the chlorine gas is already chlorinating. It's just the pH that neutralizes the hydroxide. The loss of hydrogen gas causes the loss of CO2, which raises the pH, and oh no, I've gone cross-eyed. Not really, that's an Austin Powers reference, but this is confusing stuff. That's really all I'm saying. But here's the thing. All of that chemistry happens really quickly because water's flowing through this salt cell. And it's not just flowing slowly, it's moving pretty quickly. This has to happen very, very quick. And all of this chemistry depends on having enough conductivity in the water. Conductivity may sound familiar when we talked about ORP, oxidation reduction potential. Conductivity in water means how fast can electrons move through water? Well, electricity is electrons, and so is ORP and oxidation. That's all electrons. How well can electrons transfer? How fast can they move? So it's very similar to that, but in this sense, it's basically how fast can electrolysis and how efficiently can electrolysis occur. So if you're running electricity through water, you need enough conductivity for that to happen efficiently. And there's two main driving factors of conductivity of water in the sense of salt chlorine generation. Those two factors are water temperature and salinity. With water temperature, the colder the water, the less conductive it is. The warmer the water, the more conductive it is. With salinity, the less salinity you have, the less conductive. The more salt or the more salinity, the more conductive. Now, why that matters is salt systems have safeguards built into them to protect themselves from power surges and things like that. So if your water is too cold or it doesn't have enough salt, it will shut down, or at minimum, it will alarm and then eventually shut down because it's too much electricity running through to try to create chlorine, and that can actually burn up the system. It puts a lot of stress on the salt system. So you get an alarm. If you have a salt system, you know what I'm talking about. Usually it's a blinking red light or a beep or something like that. Hey, I need more salt, or hey, it's getting too cold. As far as I know, salt systems don't actually say that. I don't think they actually have a speaker with a voice, but it made sense in my head. It's trying to tell you something. It's saying there is not enough conductivity in this water for one reason or another, or maybe both, and it cannot produce efficiently, so it's going to shut down and protect itself. And that's a pretty good thing. So I talked to the major manufacturers of salt pools or salt systems, and I asked, all right, what are your minimums and maximums? Where are your parameters for safeguards? So for salinity, depending on the manufacturer, it's usually between 2,700 and 2,900 parts per million of salt, not TDS in general, salt. TDS includes salt, but TDS is total dissolved solids. That also includes total hardness or calcium hardness, alkalinity, etc. What this system cares about is salinity. So it has a mechanism for reading salinity at the expense of, or at the exclusion of the other things. The salinity is what matters. So you need, at minimum, typically 3,000 parts per million salinity for these systems to work. Just like general rule of thumb. Now, ideal, again, depending on the manufacturer, is usually between 3,200 and 3,600 parts per million of salinity, of salt. The maximum is generally around 4,500 parts per million salt. Now, you might be thinking, maximum, what's wrong with more conductivity? Well, the thing is, you won't actually be running enough electricity through it for it to create, and it can actually create too much chlorine if it did. So it's almost too conductive. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing in this case. So you really want to be in that ideal range for optimal chlorine performance and optimal energy efficiency. You want to make sure your salinity level is in that ideal range. It does make a big difference on how much energy is consumed and how efficiently chlorine is produced. Now, for water temperature, I also asked those same manufacturers, and the coldest those systems work, depending on the system, is typically between 55 and 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's just say 60 to be safe as a minimum. If you dip below 60, there's a really good chance the system's going to alarm, if not shut off. Because the conductivity is so low, it's going to be too much electricity, it's too much stress, and the thing, it can get damaged. Too much power surge, This is a safeguard to protect the system itself. That is generally why salt systems do not work in the cold. And that's okay. I mean, nobody's swimming in 60-degree water unless it's a polar plunge. Raising my hand now, I've done it. I don't recommend. It's really, really cold. But the other thing is you don't really have reproducing organisms in 60-degree water. Not very fast anyway. So if you do need to chlorinate, just add some liquid chlorine, or add some cal-hypo shock or something like that. But the salt system is not going to work. Which means when you're containing pH and you're working your LSI strategy throughout the winter, you can have a little bit more alkalinity then because you don't have the pH getting driven up by that salt cell as much. Salt cell's not firing. So when we say in our previous episodes and in our teaching that salt pools should have about 60 alkalinity, yes, they should, total alkalinity. They should if you have enough calcium hardness and the water is warm enough that the salt cell is actually working. So if it's not, and it's in the winter, you probably want more like 80 or 90 alkalinity to help insulate for the cold water to manage the LSI. So just keep that in mind. So I think I've covered everything that I want to here, amazingly. Now, for my next trick, I'm going to try to summarize all of this in one breath. Wish me luck. We dissolve salt in water. The salt has a sodium chloride. The sodium separates from the chloride. When that chloride goes through the salt cell, which is passing electricity through the anode and the cathode, that electricity charges it. When it dissolves in water, it creates chlorine gas, hydrogen gas, and a hydroxide. The sodium that separated from the chloride binds to the hydroxide, creating sodium hydroxide, which is neutralized by the low pH of the chlorine gas, and the net effect is zero, except that you have hydrogen gas, H2, that does not dissolve in off gases, which creates turbulence and aeration, and therefore you also lose CO2, which raises the pH. Oh yeah, did it. I haven't swum in a long time, but I feel like I still got it. Okay, now for the second part of this, here we go again. The chlorine gas that is created then dissolves in water and creates hypochlorous acid, HOCl. That is the same exact chemistry chlorination of adding liquid chlorine or trichlor or cal-hypo, because they all create hypochlorous acid in some form. They just have different byproducts. In the case of a salt cell, the byproducts are going to be hydrogen gas, loss of CO2, sodium hydroxide, etc. But the net effect is basically like adding liquid chlorine to the pool, sodium hypochlorite. But the salt cell never actually creates sodium hypochlorite. That's a misconception in the industry. It creates basically the net effect of it, but it doesn't actually create sodium hypochlorite. Oh man, this is I like this challenge. I might start doing the Rule Your Pool podcast in breath intervals. It's got me going. I'm starting to break a sweat. Okay, now, finally, all of this depends on the conductivity of water, which is determined by the water temperature and the salinity in the pool. You want to be in the optimal ranges, and if it's too cold or too dilute, so to speak, you're not going to get enough chlorine efficiency, so the system has safeguards in it to shut down so it doesn't have a power surge and break the system or put stress on it. There isn't really a high maximum water temperature to worry about in swimming pools, but there is 4,500 parts per million salt that might be a little bit too high because it wouldn't use enough electricity to create chlorine. Oh, man. I'm starting to get lightheaded. All right, I think we covered this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope that it explains how salt systems actually work, and I hope that I did not completely butcher it. But thank you for listening, and I mean that sincerely. I've been traveling a lot and seeing people at trade shows that listen to the podcast, and it's so cool that you're actually listening to this. It means a lot. And thank you for coming up and introducing yourself. And thank you for those of you who are emailing us at podcast@orendatech.com with your requests and questions that you have. We love this. I'm genuinely loving and looking forward to getting into my closet studio to record more. So thank you for being here. I'm Eric Knight with Orenda. This has been episode 57 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. We are coming up on the new summer season, and I look forward to being there with you as you rule your pool this year. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.